From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
With Ralph Mollus blocked by term limits from running again, next year Rhode Islanders will be choosing a new Secretary of State with responsibilities that range from election oversight to business filings. So far, 2 Democrats are seeking the office, Guillaume de Ramel of Newport and Nellie Gorbea of North Kingstown. Both of them say they have big plans for the office. This week on the first half of Newsmakers, candidate for Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea. Then, when the Navy shipped out of Rhode Island's Quonset Point in 1974, it dealt a heavy blow to the state's economy. 40 years later, Quonset is once again a hub of activity and employment, home of 175 companies that employ nearly 10,000 people, including its biggest tenant, Electric Boat, which just signed a new 25-year lease. What went right at Quonset, and does its story have lessons for the rest of the state? On the second half of Newsmakers, Quonset Development Corporation Executive Director Stephen King. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Thanks to Snowstorm Hercules on Friday and our extended coverage, I'm flying solo today. Ted Nesi is not joining me on the panel, but we welcome our guest, Nellie Gorbea, candidate for Secretary of State. Hi, Nellie.
Hi, good morning.
Why do you want the job?
You know, I want to be Secretary of State because I want to make government work for all Rhode Islanders. I've had experience in the private sector. I've had experience in the public sector. In fact, I was Deputy Secretary of State from 2002 to 2006 under Secretary of State Matt Brown. So I come ready to lead into that office on day one. I know what to do.
There was some talk. I talked to some political insiders doing my homework prior to the show, and there was some hope that you might actually run for Lieutenant Governor. Was that a thought at all for you, or was it Secretary of State all the way?
No, it's Secretary of State all the way because I know that office. This is not about running for a title. It's about actually getting the job done. And I am that person. I know that I can walk into that office. I know the employees. I know their strengths. I know where the challenges are. And I can make government work better for all Rhode Islanders.
Let's talk about some specifics in that office. Voter ID, correct me if I'm wrong, but you would like to repeal that, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. It was passed with wide support from Democrats. It was signed by Governor Lincoln Chafee. It had some support by some minority lawmakers. And nationally, Rhode Island has actually gotten some pretty positive press for being a more thoughtful, if you will, voter ID law. A lot of people think, why shouldn't people have to present an ID when they go to vote? When I go to a department store, I give them my credit card. They ask me for an ID. Why should voting be, less secure than something like that?
It's not so much about it being less secure. It's the question for me is, was there a problem that required this solution?
Some lawmakers thought there were.
So
you're saying they're wrong?
I would say that we did not have the compelling evidence to make a change of that magnitude. That the right to vote within a democracy is one of the most absolutely important rights that you have. People have died for the right to vote.
How does presenting an ID strip you of that right to vote?
It basically presents a challenge. So if you're on your way to the polling place and you suddenly think, oh my gosh, like I don't have my ID on me, you're going to turn around. The chances are that you may not go back. There are actually still people, and I know it's hard for people to understand, but I have actually had conversations with people who either know or have had challenges getting IDs. And so while, yes, the law here is about as open as it could be, again, was there a problem? I don't think so. I don't think we have the evidence that really requires us to do that. And we are being held up as a poster child by a lot of other people who honestly are using voter ID laws as voter suppression.
Well, that's mainly because we're a democratic state, and I think that was nationally a surprise to a lot of people. So how passionately do you feel about it? Are you going to lobby the General Assembly to repeal voter ID if you become Secretary of State?
I am going to stand aside everybody else who's in favor of repealing that law. I'm someone who comes with a background of trying to engage people in voting. I want more people to vote. And so anything that presents a barrier is very troublesome to me.
All right, let's talk about the current Secretary of State, Ralph Mollus. What letter grade would you give him?
I think that Secretary Mollus had a very strong foundation from which to base his administration, which was the 4 years that we were there under Matt Brown. We did a lot of taking the paper-driven process.
Of course, you're totally objective on that because he was your boss at the time.
That's right. Well, no, and I actually did a lot, we worked very hard during those 4 years. So I think he started in a really good place. I think he's done some positive things in that office.
Like what?
Like took the business Fast Start portal and made it even easier to use. That was something that we had started, and he really improved greatly. His Spanish language communications have always been very professional, very good in terms of reaching out to a broad number of constituents out there. So, you know, there has been some good things. I have to say, I stand, opposite of him in this voter ID issue, and so I guess overall I'd give him a B.
Beside voter ID, is there anything you would have done differently?
Every Secretary of State comes into that office with their own strengths and perspectives, and I think where I would take the office differently is I come in with an experience in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, in the private sector. I have that diversity and depth of experience that looks at problems in a variety of ways, and so I'm hoping to provide solutions in that Secretary of State office that are different than what others have proposed before.
I have a couple of other litmus test questions for you, but you brought up the nonprofit part of it. And I do want to talk about affordable housing. Still a major problem in Rhode Island, really everywhere, but particularly in the Northeast. You were executive director of Housing Works Rhode Island, but stepped down to run for Secretary of State. Did you have second thoughts about that? Considering there's so much work still to be done, that you would leave Housing Works Rhode Island?
You know, I was there for over 5.5 years, and it was a great experience. And I think it prepared me quite well in a number of ways for this next step as Secretary of State. I have no regrets in terms of we had, a great time there, and we were able to pass the housing bond in 2010, which I think is right now, as we're talking, providing jobs, providing housing for people out there. It is a tough problem, but it is one that is near and dear to my heart. So I will continue to carry that housing agenda within me. You know,
I'm always fascinated why people decide to run for office, and arguably one could say that you could have more of an impact as the head of that agency, affecting change in people's lives, than you would in what many people call some sleepy corner of the State House.
Oh, but it's not a sleepy corner of the State House. It's a great corner of the State House, actually. No. The Secretary of State, I mean, if you look at it, it has the opportunity to touch, the business community here, to help make government work better, to grow our economy, to engage people in their government, and to make it easier for people to find out and hold their government accountable. So I actually see this as a very important office within state government, and the diversity of people's lives that it touches in our state is quite great.
There was a push to get rid of the master lever in the voting booth, or straight ticket voting. Should we keep it or get rid of it?
The master lever is one of those things where you take an old technology, the lever machines, and put it into new technology, and it doesn't really quite work. It's very confusing when you have nonpartisan ballots included with partisan ballots to have that master lever arrow, if you will. So I actually favor getting rid of it at this point, given the technology that we have right now.
I guess I'll ask you the same question about the master lever that I did the other one. How would you lobby to get rid of it? How hard would you push to make that change?
I really do think that this is a problem. Anything that I want to make government easier to use. I want to make all of our services easier to get. And so if there's something like that confuses people, we need to get rid of it.
You have a Democratic primary challenger, Guillaume de Ramel. Are there any differences between the two of you? I mean, I guess make the pitch to the primary voter, which there are fewer of than in a general election. What's the difference between you and Guillaume?
I think that I bring a diversity and depth of experience to that office that makes me the best qualified candidate on day one. I can walk into that office, I know what it does, I know what it needs to be doing.
And you think he lacks that experience?
And I think he has a very different set of experiences. I come into this with 20 years of experience of rolling up my sleeves in the community, being a leader in the nonprofit sector, in the Latino community, as a working mom. I know how hard it is for people to get ahead in this state. And so I look forward to being in that office and making it easier for all Rhode Islanders.
Are you going to support any particular candidate for governor?
No.
And what kind of support are you getting? I think I saw a press release that you're getting the support of Central Falls Mayor James Diosa. Anyone else on that list? There's been actually a fair number of really wonderful people who are now supporting. And I would say
the best part of it is through the grassroots excitement that my candidacy has generated. But Representative Edie Aiello, former Representative Rhoda Perry, Representative Art Handy, Councilwoman Camille Villa-Wilkinson. There's a number of people out throughout the state that are stepping up forward. Former gubernatorial candidate Mirth York. It's really quite exciting. But you know, overall, as great as those endorsements are, the best are from people on the street. From having somebody say, I had not registered to vote, and I'm embarrassed to tell you, but in the end, I went out and got registered because I am so excited about the fact that you're on the ballot, Nellie, and I want to go out and vote for you. And to have that moment when somebody feels that the ballot speaks to them, that they will take that step forward and hopefully continue to be stepping forward and become engaged in our democracy is one of the best things about this candidacy.
Every candidate that comes on the show usually uses the word grassroots when they talk about their campaigning, but the fact is you do need money to run a campaign. You need the yard signs, you need to get those mailers out, you need to maybe do a poll, whatever it might be, airtime. I imagine it must be difficult to raise money as a down ballot candidate. How has fundraising been going?
You know, fundraising actually has been going quite well. It is definitely a full-time job. It is one of the many reasons I stepped down from my job at Housing Works. But it actually has been going very well. Again, it's the excitement, and it's sure it may not be all at the $1,000 level, but there's a lot of $15, $25, $50 contributions out there in Rhode Island.
But there's a lot of candidates asking for the $15, the $25, the $100. You know, you have a packed gubernatorial ticket, mayoral. We have a lot of state offices that are wide open right now. Are you finding that there's a lot of people who are like, I have only so much that I can give, and I have to be picky?
For every one of those, it says, you know, I'm tapped out. I have at least 5 others that say, I am so excited that you're running, and they're stepping forward. So.
There were some real problems with the 2012 election day. Ballots were sent to the wrong places. Polling place times and locations changed, and it created a lot of confusion. I remember working that night and getting calls about some real problems. And we had the executive director of the Rhode Island Board of Elections, Bob Cando, on this program as sort of a post-mortem of the elections as to what went wrong there, because a lot of that happens with the Board of Elections where the rubber meets the road, than the Secretary of State's office. But there also has to be a lot of interaction between those two offices. And I'm wondering what you would do to address those problems and work with the Board of Elections to try and make sure that doesn't happen again if you were Secretary of State.
You know, as I've said before, because of my experience being a nonprofit, public, and private sector leader, I come with that experience in bringing together disparate agendas and disparate constituencies. And so in some ways, I think that that's what really prepares me well for sitting down with the Board of Election, with the leadership there, and saying, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. While it is not the purview, it's not the responsibility of the Secretary of State to handle the day of elections, in the end, people look at the Secretary of State as the chief state election official. And so we need to, not just right before election day, but all throughout the year, have that open channel of communication with the Board of Elections. What's happening? How can I help? Not just do this or do that, but what can I do to help? What other resources can we bring into this?
I want to point out to our viewers that we're taping on a Friday morning when we had the big snowstorm Hercules, and you had quite a drive coming in, so I do appreciate Nellie Gorbea, candidate for Secretary of State, you coming on the program. When we come back, we're actually talking about something, and might be rare on this program, things going right down at Quonset. The Executive Director, Stephen King. Stay with us, you're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me for the second half, he's the Executive Director of the Quonset Development Corporation, Stephen King. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
One of the reasons we wanted to have you on was to talk about the new 25-year lease with Electric Boat. Obviously, good news. They're expanding a submarine program there now. More jobs presumably coming in for that. But to close this deal, my understanding was there were some tax incentives put into place for them. What were those incentives, and was this, you know the mindset in Rhode Island, right, Stephen?
Right,
was this a special deal for Electric Boat?
Right, it absolutely was not a special deal for Electric Boat, and to correct you, Tim, there were not any tax incentives in this deal. So Quonset Development Corporation runs and operates the Quonset Business Park, and EB is leasing now over 100 acres of property from us, and the incentive is built into their lease payments. So the amount of rent they pay us, we have a twofold incentive that applies to all companies in the business park from one-person companies to the 2,700 at EB. So they get a break for the term of the lease, for the length of the lease. In this case, 25 years, they get a 16% discount. And then they get an incentive for employment based on the wages they pay their employees. So 0.5% of the wages they pay their employees is going to go back to them. That's capped at half of the rent for the employment that they bring to our state.
Thanks for the correction, but one might think that a rent to a quasi-public agency is also a tax, which is why I use that term.
Right, but technically, I just wanted to make the point that it's the revenues that are.
If there was a company that was interested in starting a business at Quonset, they would get the same exact treatment.
Exactly right. So if based on the term of your rent, like I mentioned, you get a little discount, and then you get a discount for the wages you pay your employees. So whether you have 10 employees or 10,000 employees, you get the same exact deal that Electric Boat got.
How do you compete with the Texases of the world that can offer? I mean, you're not the legislative branch of Rhode Island. You can't offer lower taxes, and you are competing nationally for these companies to come in. What are you telling companies how are you selling Rhode Island?
Right. So unfortunately, we can't do that. And what we have done though is use the tools that we have in our toolbox to make our property as enticing as we can make it. With the incentives I just mentioned, we've also done a lot of work to improve the situation on the ground so that we have a very certain process to development. We've gone and done all the due diligence that you would need to do for a real estate person to come to a project, looking at the permits and put everything in place for a particular property, and now that's all in place. So what we're offering is speed to success and a certain path to success. That's what we can do. We can't control, all the environment in the country or in New England or what have you. We can only work within the realm that we have to work in.
One of the questions I had was about permitting, and Quonset's on the water. You think, okay, now the company has to deal with the CRMC, and then every company has to deal with DEM. Have you tackled those? And
matter of fact, we have. So we've taken the time in the last couple of years here when the economy is a little slow to go in and partner up with CRMC and DEM. We have actually pre-designed and permitted all the sites that we have. There's 37 sites that now have permits in place, and we can offer a business 90-day process from the time we meet them to the time that they can build on the site.
Now, we talked in the open of the program that there was quite the turnaround at Quonset from when the Navy pulled out, and really since 2004, right, when QDC... Right,
2005, at early part of that year.
Okay, and there's, 10,000 jobs. That is obviously good news, but it didn't come cheap. There was $665 million in federal money primarily, and state money as well, since 1980. I feel like I always see a press release from Senator Jack Reed that he's down there once again talking about another infrastructure change. Make the case for the people who think, geez, that's a lot of taxpayer money that went essentially to the private sector.
Well, I don't think that's correct. So it went to the property that the state owns at Quonset. So that asset now can be repurposed over and over again to promote and have jobs on the site. So those investments are what lead to other investments. We've had the private sector more than double the investment that was made by the public sector on the property. So we're getting a great return for the investment that's been made. The jobs that continue, those folks have payroll to take home to their families and feed their families. And so it's all built on success within itself.
One specific one, and this is get it a little wonky on the show, but sometimes we do that. You had a big mobile harbor crane that was installed at Quonset, and it used, I think, $22 million of federal money, a Tiger grant, to get that going. Now, the crane was built in Germany, so I'm wondering if we're getting much use out of it now. Has it created American jobs? Is it just sitting there, or are you using it?
Right. So matter of fact, we just
talk about what it is too. So I say a mobile harbor crane.
So a mobile harbor crane, in this case, it's a large purpose-built crane for a port, has a large operator seat up high so they can see over a ship to unload a ship. The crane itself was about $5 million of the $22.3 million you mentioned. The rest of that money went to infrastructure improvements on the pier facilities and so forth at the Port of Davisville. So the crane, we've used it on several occasions. Matter of fact, we just used it a couple weeks ago to unload some generators for Torrey Plastics, one of our larger tenants who's building a cogeneration plant on their site. So the crane has already been put to use to help create and promote.
Is that what you say to some companies? Like, hey,
we're a port and we have this, and these cranes are very specific, and that's why they were made in Germany, because that's the only place that makes these cranes.
That's right.
Is that one of the selling points?
It absolutely is. So our port has been tremendously successful. The Port of Davisville is the 10th largest port for importing automobiles in all of North America. But this crane now allows us to get into what we call low-low, lift-on, lift-off cargoes. And I invite all Rhode Island companies that have anything large to move, that's heavy, anything like that, to call us, because we can help you.
So things seem to be booming, I guess, for lack of a better word, over at Quonset. And I have a basic question. Unemployment is really high in this state. Are there jobs at Quonset?
There are, and I invite all your viewers to go to quonsetjobs.com and check it out, because there's jobs there right now that people can apply for.
Is there a skill set that's lacking in this region, in this state, that is needed at Quonset?
I think we have a very diverse group of tenants at the park, so I wouldn't pick one out over the other necessarily. So if viewers go to quonsetjobs.com and look at that, there are jobs all the way from working for the submarine builder, we mentioned electric boat, down to technical lab folks, to folks that work in warehouses. So there's a broad spectrum there.
So how much room is, we talked about electric boat, I think Quonset, Job Lot also, and then of course the cars that come in there. What is Davisville, which is part of Quonset, is the 10th?
10th in all of North America for auto logistics.
So those are the big ticket items at Quonset.
Right.
And you mentioned a couple of others. I think there are a total of 175 companies?
There's over 175, yes.
How much room is left?
So we have 293 acres left on 37 sites. So those sites range anywhere from 2 acres all the way to 56 acres. And we can build upwards of 3 million square feet more of buildings on the site. There's about 9 million square feet of buildings on the site today.
You have to put that in perspective for me when you say 3 million square foot facility. Are there any massive parcels of land available, or is it more sort of smaller parcels? And so does that mean, are we done looking for the electric boats of the world?
Right. So as I mentioned, the largest site we have is 56 acres. We have another one that's 53, and the third largest one is 30. Everything else is 10 acres or less, and some of it can be combined into maybe 15 or 20. But those, we're sort of closing the gap on the real big fish. But really, if you look at the spectrum of the employment we have, our success is rooted in the smaller businesses, those that have 40, 50 employees. To put all your eggs in one big basket like that is a little nerve-wracking when you think about it from a park operations perspective anyway. But to really think that we're going to get another company as large as Electric Boat is pretty unlikely at this point.
I talked a little bit about the federal grants. A lot of people know that Quonset Development Corporation is a quasi-public agency of the state. Do you get any taxpayer support for your operating budget? Basically, who pays for it?
So the Quonset Development Corporation is funded through the operations at the park itself. So from the rents we receive from the tenants, we do sell utilities, we run and operate the water system, the wastewater system, and those revenue sources as well. And the revenues derived at the seaport all go into our operating bucket. A lot of the improvements you mentioned in the capital money came from the state. The voters were very kind over the years. There were 3 bond issues that were put forth for Quonset, help improve the infrastructure. But our daily operating budget is based on our operations.
Thanks to the 38 Studios, hangover, I guess you could say, there's been a lot of focus on quasi-public agencies. That was handled by the EDC, which is now the Commerce Corporation, which technically QDC falls under. But the bond issue became front and center. So some people might be wondering, do you have the authority to issue taxpayer-backed bonds?
We do not, but in that climate, we did have EDC issue a bond for us just last year. The legislature worked with us to give us the power through EDC to offer a bond to dredge the Port of Davisville. The first time the port's been dredged since 1980 when the state took the property.
Why was that necessary?
To keep the channel open for the ship traffic that comes in and out of the port today and maintain that return on investment that's happening down there with NORAD.
And how big was the bond?
$7 million.
And is it taxpayer-backed?
It's a revenue bond that QDC is paying the debt service back on based on the port revenues we receive.
Is there anything that's holding Quonset back? Does something need to happen there to accelerate growth? If you could flip a switch as the executive director there, what would it be?
There's really nothing particular at Quonset. I think we've really done a good job with all of our partners, from the local community in North Kingstown to the governor to the legislature. You mentioned Senator Reed and the rest of the congressional delegation. Everybody's been very helpful putting a team effort together to make Quonset successful. At this point, we just need the economy overall to bounce back a little bit across the
So,
country.
you know,
mean,
one of the things I wanted to get to is I wanted you to diagnose that. I mean, here again, a relative success story, particularly here in Rhode Island. The rest of the country seems to be bouncing back. We just have been stagnant since 2008, and you could even argue prior to that. What is it about Rhode Island?
You know, I don't know the answer directly. I can, you know, in my realm at Quonset, things have continued to be fairly successful. We continue to grow year over year, so that's been occurring even in the down economy. It's just, we can set the table for business, but we can't make the investments for business. So business has to organically grow, and it has to make its own path, and we're trying to make that path available to them.
30 seconds left in the program, Stephen. How did Quonset fare in the recession?
Quite well. We continue, as I mentioned, we continue to grow year over year. We did have a couple of businesses close. Stanley Bostitch left Rhode Island.
Right,
We lost a plant there. And we did have a retail store, a Lowe's store that closed up. But we did add over 2,000 jobs over this last 10-year period. So things continue to improve on a daily basis. And
Stephen King, Executive Director for the Quonset Development Corporation, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Our first half guest was Nellie Gorbea. She's a candidate for Secretary of State. If you missed any of it, you can catch it online at WPRI.com. It's under the Newsmakers section, of course, because that is the program. I'm sure Ted Nesi will be back with me on the program next week. Thanks for watching us, and we'll see you next week on Newsmakers.